Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us here today for another installment of Exploring Our World, where we here at Colonial Williamsburg take a bit of a deeper dive into the minds and experiences of life here in Williamsburg in the 18th century. My name is Brandon Lyles, and today I'm joined by Dr. Kelly Arehart, who is here to talk with us about superstition in 18th century Williamsburg. Kelly, would you mind taking a moment and telling us a little about yourself?
Sure. As Brandon said, my name is Kelly Arehart. I'm one of the historians here at Colonial Williamsburg. I've worked for Colonial Williamsburg in some position, in one form or fashion, for 12 years. This is a particular topic that's near and dear to my heart. Our research department is always looking for new and different things to do research on. We know quite a bit about religion in 18th century Virginia, but we don't know very much about superstition, and we don't know very much about the lived experience of belief. And that is one of the reasons, and I've been kind of tasked to do research on that, and it's one of the reasons I'm here today.
And we are looking forward to taking your questions, so please make sure to post those in the comments, and we'll get to as many of those as we possibly can. But to start off with, I do have a little bit of a question here. Let's start off by defining what superstition means.
That's a great idea. And we're using a very simple definition. The one that you see on your screen. And one of the most important parts of this definition is the language of unfounded in objective reality. So what it is essentially things they can't explain, because there really is, for many people, not an objective reality. And because of this, different people set up what superstition means. So we have a considerable written record from the European Virginia perspective, and because of that, since the things that they know look so different from what you're seeing in the belief system of other groups of people, they decide when something is superstition. In fact, there's a term actually to talk about these differences and sort of the way they have their beliefs. The term is cosmology, and we have a simple definition for this as well. Really what this is about is how a group of people understands the cosmos, the entirety of the universe. So it's not just about religion, and it's not narrowly focused. The idea is it's everything. And when you talk about everything and multiple groups of people who are very, very different, you're going to see this split. And since the European Virginians were the ones writing everything down, that's why they are the ones who set up the parameters of superstition.
And I also want to ask you about something that comes up a lot this time of year, and that's witchcraft. Mm-hmm. We here in Virginia are a little bit familiar with a witchcraft trial, but most people are very familiar with Salem and what happens up in Salem. Can you tell us a little bit about the similarities and differences between the two?
Absolutely. Part of it is you have to understand the world that they're coming out of. In the 17th century, actually 1603, the King of England himself, James I, writes a book called Demonology. And one of the important things about the book Demonology is that it shows ways to identify witches. If it's considered worth the time of the King of England, clearly this is going to be something that is, if nothing else, at note for other people. So when you have the Virginians coming in 1607 and you have Puritan separatists coming in 1620, this is very much part of the way they understand their world. Having said that, now, like I said, they're both coming from England, but they don't believe the same thing. Their cosmologies are somewhat different, and that has to do with religion. You have the Puritan separatists in Massachusetts, you have members of the Church of England here in Virginia, and because of their religious beliefs, even though their root is the same, they understand the natural and supernatural world differently. So what you'll see sometimes in Massachusetts is, let's say there's a horrible thunderstorm, something absolutely devastating, and they kind of look at each other and say, is God judging us? You have the same storm in Virginia, and it's, oh man, this is going to ruin our crops. Is God also judging us? So you'll notice which goes first for each group of people. And because of this, we have the instance of Grace Sherwood, which is our most famous witch here in Virginia, 1706. And the reason she's the most famous is because we actually know things about this trial. She's accused of misdemeanor witchcraft down in Virginia Beach. She's indicted for felony witchcraft, and yes, there is a difference between felony and misdemeanor witchcraft. She's brought here to the capital city, Williamsburg, and she is tried by the general court, the highest court in all of Virginia. We don't actually know the outcome. We believe that she was acquitted, but it tells you a lot about the city of Williamsburg and the world and sort of the world it inhabits when they're bringing in someone to stand trial for witchcraft, as opposed to dealing with some of the other types of felonies you'd see more often. This kind of begins to go away all over British North America after there's a law passed in 1735, and that law is the Witchcraft Act, and it's passed in Parliament. And basically, this law is kind of cool because the way the law is structured is it is against the law for someone to hire someone to be a witch or to do witchy things. So basically what it's saying is, shame on you for not knowing better, you who tried to hire a witch. And part of this is because we get a big shift away from the way people think about witchcraft, witches, and superstition. And this process, the very basic process, happens both here in Virginia and in Massachusetts.
Lara has a question. She asks, what superstitions did they have about funerals?
These are two of my favorite things, and they're together. Now, this is a very regional thing in terms of what their concerns are. And there are basically folk practices, for lack of a better word, some that you see all over British North America, some that you really don't. A good example of one that you do see all over British North America is the using linen to cover mirrors and windows. That I can trace actually to almost every colony. You'll also see in some other places it's used to drape clocks, usually in clocks. So that's one of the things that they're doing. So it has no religious purpose, but it's the idea of, and there's a bunch of different reasons why this is. There's the whole, the idea that's respect for the dead. Part of it is the idea of making it so the soul can move. So the specifics of the action depends on where you are, really. But that's something that everybody is doing. There's a lot of superstition, particularly early in the 18th century, in terms of what door a coffin goes through on the church. There is in some instances, and this is not only true in Virginia, it is in a few other places as well, to go through the west door is considered a potential problem. In terms of, so that's sort of in terms of actually participating in the funeral itself. The specifics then from there, depending on who you're talking to, where you're talking to, is really going to depend. But those are two that are really common all the way up and down British North America.
We have another question here from Dawn. Dawn asks, were superstitions different between people who were formally educated and those who were not?
That's a great question. And the answer is, it depends when you're talking about. We're talking about, say, right when the Virginians and the Massachusetts come to British North America, they're actually both really superstitious. A really great example of this is Cotton Mather. He writes a number of books. One of the ones that he's most known for is Witchcraft. And he's actually justifying his role in the Salem witch trials. And by our standards, and even by standards of people later, this is incredibly superstitious. Things that he is saying is scientific fact to us looks absolutely bananas, simply put. So he is tremendously well educated. He believes the set of things that we certainly look back and say, this is superstition. So the answer is, it's about this. It's not quite the same because the specifics are different sometimes, but more or less, at least early, those are the people who are actually just as superstitious as everyone else.
We have another question here. This one is from Christian, who says, as I understand, people believed that they could die if they lay down flat. Was this a common belief in Virginia?
You don't see it very much in Virginia. There's a number of reasons why people don't lie flat when they sleep. But I will say that this is something I've never seen come up in Virginia. I think this is something that's more associated with, actually, like upstate New York is the only place I've ever seen it talked about. And I've only ever seen it talked about in the 19th century.
Interesting. What about people who practice what we might consider magic, but weren't considered witches? Did that also differ among the cultures in colonial Virginia?
Yes, and that is a great way to talk about both bad witches and what we would call good witches. Now, when we talk about the European the English tradition good witches, they're known as cunning folk. And the idea behind cunning folk is that they can provide certain services that are actually very similar to what we think of as bad witches. In the sense of usually they're focusing on things like prosperity, protection, love, power, that kind of thing. So you actually see a moment where the two groups kind of collide. And this moment comes in the form of a witch's bottle. So this is a modern witch's bottle that I actually made as an example. And you can see in it there is a bunch of pins, a felt heart that is stabbed through. There's also fingernails and hair. They also would contain anything else that you could attach it to a single person. So they know that that's the person who needs to be protected. So someone who's going to be more along the line of a cunning folk are going to help with the construction of this because they're trying to scare off the bad witches. And the part of that really points that are all of the pins. Sometimes there's also iron nails in them. And they're taken and they are buried upside down. So you've got people who can help with this sort of thing and they're turned to very enthusiastically. And then you have the people who have to be protected. Now, when we talk about the conjurers, which is what you're seeing out of the African-American tradition, you're seeing them out of the African-American tradition. They are sort of born once again, kind of like the cunning folk, is that they have a gift, and there's a recognition of a gift. And coming out of especially the African tradition, the West African tradition, is that there's a recognition of that, and there's a nature of education that's going to vary and be very different, because they're going to serve a very particular role within the society, kind of like the cunning folk do in the English tradition. With conjurers, though, it gets a little more complicated when you're here in British North America, because some of the things that they do, part of their cosmology, part of the way they understand and interact with their universe, are terrifying to whites. And one of the things that's an important part of that is medicine. And after 1743, there's a law that basically says no black person can administer medication to a white person on pain of death. So part of that very clearly is about poisoning. But it also ties to a bigger fear about groups of people who have the gift but wouldn't necessarily be considered witches.
Betsy has a question here. Betsy says, Hex signs are popular in eastern Pennsylvania. Any similar symbolism in Virginia in colonial times?
Yes, there is. There are certain types of markings that are placed on buildings, particularly in the construction in places that you can't really see. That concept of marking a space as being protected is really important. This is true up and down British North America. This is that concern that for the Europeans, the world outside of them is terrifying. So being able to protect the domicile is a big deal. So the answer is yes, there are some. I know that's important in Pennsylvania, and it is that bigger concern is tied to that element.
Doug was wondering, what were some of the farming-based superstitions?
Okay, so I'm trying to think of the best examples of this, actually. One of the things that you see a lot is the idea of protection of a barn. Which actually goes back to that idea of keeping the domicile safe. It's also keeping your animals and your livelihood safe. So what you see lots of things like in the Pennsylvania tradition. This is also a place where you're going to see the horseshoes, which have an ancient background in that space as well. Luck and protection is very important to any kind of white magic and it's sort of the way it manifests. So some of them, of course, there's concerns about if you certain types of stones being turned over. In those instances, if something is found while plowing, that becomes a real issue. Now, we're in Tidewater, Virginia. There aren't a lot of big stones, so that's not necessarily a concern here. But when you get into some other corners of British North America, that can be an ill omen. Obviously, anything tied to weather is a concern. And this is true. One of the things that you see about witches, and actually there's a woman who's coming over to Virginia in 1646, and she's executed as a witch because she changed the weather. Because the weather is everything when you live in agrarian society.
That makes sense. We have another question here. This one is from Matushka, who says, what are some superstitions which came from enslaved or free persons from Africa and the Caribbean?
That's a great question, and it's a really important question because one of the things about both that experience and then what ultimately becomes the American experience is the blending of those two. And what you see is in terms of what comes over, they're very adaptable in the sense of, not that they're giving up their faith, in that they can make sense of the world around them as it's beginning to sort of shift under their feet. So one of the things that you'll see, and this is actually, I think the best example of this is the religion of Voodoo. It's a religion. And it's one of these things where they were able to take that West African tradition of having gods that are associated with very particular circumstances or objects and the like as part of this system. And then when they combine with Roman Catholicism in Haiti and then you see, of course, in New Orleans, is the Roman Catholic saints work a similar way. So the fact that they're able to blend them means they didn't lose anything, but they were able to adapt. So in terms of ones that are sort of purely African, part of that, there are a lot of overlaps and similarities, but a really great example of something that really we can clearly point back to Africa are pierced coins. Pierced coins are this is actually in Colonial Williamsburg archaeological collection. You'll notice at the bottom there's like a little hole. Pierced coins were important because they were seen as incredibly lucky. Having a pierced coin upon you or actually tied, it wasn't uncommon to see them tied to ankles or around the neck. This is something that we have examples of not only in Virginia, but up and down the East Coast, down into the West Indies. We know that that is a great example of something that survives.
That's a great artifact, too.
It really is.
Judy and Mark ask, what did they think of Halloween, and did they celebrate in any way?
That is such a good question because Halloween has become such an American holiday. And I've, friends from other parts of the world say, we don't celebrate Halloween the way you guys do. We don't get it. And part of the reason is, especially when you're talking about the English-speaking countries, so mostly I'm talking about the UK and a few people from Australia, is that wasn't part of their tradition. So when you look at the English tradition of celebrating things spooky, it's Christmas. It's actually one of the time periods they do it. Halloween doesn't become a big thing in America until the Irish begin to arrive in the mid-19th century. So what happens is they arrive and slowly but surely sort of mainstream white culture begins to take it up, and by 1900 it becomes an event that is it's kind of sanitized in the sense of like children go to parties instead of children go around throwing pumpkins at people's houses. So the Halloween we know is very recent. It's based on the arrival of the Irish and doesn't really have a neat analogy or something analogous to it, which is sort of, people always say that when they come here. What about Halloween? And the answer is, come back at Christmas.
I've been waiting to ask this particular question because the person who asked it, their name is Brandon, and it's not this one. So is there ever evidence in belief in fairy folklore in Virginia during the colonial time period?
The answer is yes. It's limited in terms of what we know, not in terms of necessarily its reach. So when we talk about fairy folk, they are a really important part of folk magic coming out of England. And fairy folk aren't like fairies the way we think of them now. They are sort of these beings, these supernatural beings, these very powerful supernatural beings who can do all kinds of things to the living, like capture them and put in, a child, have a changeling, or capture someone and let them go after 100 human years and they don't know where they are. So they do believe in this. And the thing about fairy folk in that tradition is they're scary. You don't want to mess with them. So there's very highly likely that there were spaces that looked a lot like what they knew in England and went, oh, that's where the fae live. I'm not going to touch that.
And Laura has a question, and it asks, did colonial superstitions absorb Native American ones? And I do want to take a moment just to let everybody know that coming up on Thursday, November 5th, we will have an audience here with our Native American interpreters, so make sure to tune in for that. You'll be able to get a lot of great detail from that.
Yeah. What I will say is it's a little tricky to trace, and part of the reason for this is cultural exchange between the European Virginians and the American Indian Virginians living in this area, in some ways is extensive, and we know a fair amount about it. In ways, it is not. And one of the things that we don't know terribly much about, other than what white European guys happen to sort of see at a distance, has to do with faith and belief structures. Part of this is because it's not a proselytizing faith. It's not about like going out and, in the Christian tradition of spreading the good news. And because of this, we know less, and there's sort of rules that are set up about sort of who knows what outside of a group, what can be shared. And for that reason, it's very hard to track it, both 18th century and even now, because that belief, that's a core belief system.
Lara asks, what kind of superstitions have lasted from the colonial era to now?
Oh, so many. So many. No, it's not a bad thing, though. Actually, the thing that really kind of, I think, is amazing are the ones that actually lasted from ancient times through our period to today. So an example of this is we know that during this period, there is sort of when leaving your house, the idea of like touching sort of the door jamb, sort of in hopes, basically the whole like, I'm going to come back, hopefully I'm going to come back, as they go out, and is a very simple superstition. But the thing is, we still kind of do this. If you're familiar with Notre Dame's Fighting Irish, their football team, this does sound like such a weird example. Their football team, in their locker room, they have a sign that says, play like a champion today. And you know what they do when they walk out of that locker room, that space that's their domicile? They touch that sign. So that is something that's been with us forever, that we still continue to do. So that's sort of a very basic answer of, yes, there are.
But that's a great example. Yeah, that's wonderful. Mark says, we have an entire 4th grade virtual field trip attending. This is exciting. One question that came up is what superstitions they had about devils.
That's a great question. They are doing, this is particularly true in Virginia, and this is another one that's survived, is when salt is spilled, that you're going to throw it over your left shoulder in the face of the devil. Part of it with the devil is they're going to do things to ward off the devil, and one of the big things about that is going to be protection from witches, because witches, according to this system, signed a contract with the devil. That's how they get their powers. They're not in this belief system. They don't have a gift. They actually sell their soul. And because of this, witches become a stand-in for the devil himself. So that's why things like the witch's bottle become so important. So I'm trying to think in terms of just the devil. It's hard because the devil is part of their theology, the way they understand religion, or the nature of their religion. So the way they respond to the devil looks a little different, I think, than we would expect. Some of the stuff that you'd expect it to be, a little more sort of expansive and dramatic, comes in the 19th century. And one of the reasons it comes in the 19th century is because we're getting mass immigration, where there are other countries and other groups of people who have different ideas about the devil. Now, if we're talking about New England, the devil lurks everywhere. And if you ever do any reading about this, they talk about the devil lurking everywhere. So to them and the Virginians, this is real evil and it exists. So anything like the witch's bottle and other things, because the devil has his minions, is the belief system. And that is what you have to ward off.
Is there any link between the devil and morality tales of the 18th century of any kind?
Oh yeah, I mean in terms of like outsmarting the devil.
Yes.
Yeah, there are stories in the 18th century. They're kind of similar to Devil Went Down to Georgia. Is actually a great example of a story that continues, that we know they're telling in the 18th century. We know that's something they're talking about. The idea of outwitting the devil is actually what you're seeing more in sort of folk tales than you are necessarily in terms of what they're trying to do to combat him.
And for those of you watching out there, please keep submitting questions. We still have time to take some more. I do have a question here from Allie. Was Tyromancy a thing in the 18th century, Virginia?
Tyromancy?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so one of the things that's sort of amazing about humans in general is if they've decided they want to know the future, they will use almost any kind of method they can think of to read meaning into it. So Tyromancy is actually the reading of cheese. Yeah, the reading of cheese. And what they would do is, basically, because remember, their food is not mass produced, so everything doesn't look exactly the same. So when they make cheese and they take it out, when they look at it, they examine it. Are there extra holes? Are there weird veins through it? Is it an unusual size? And that's how they kind of say, oh, well, if this is one thing, this is going to be potentially another. The biggest one that they're using during the period is cartomancy, which is playing cards. And they're using playing cards. So have you ever heard of the issue with the Ace of Spades? It comes out of that. That's where that's coming from. Actually, the really cool thing is, and we know about Williamsburg specifically, in 1775, there's an ad in the Virginia Gazette that it says that the guy selling his wares has conversation cards, which are actually kind of precursors of tarot cards, and books on divination. So we know in 1775, this is something, one, everybody's doing, and it's considered fun. Because honestly, after that 1735 law out of Parliament, when, witches aren't real, what you begin to see is all of this stuff moves into the parlor in terms of just as a form of entertainment.
And now I need to bring up a very specific topic, one that I know you're very passionate about. Williamsburg is known for ghosts, and you in particular have a background in telling some of those ghost stories here at Colonial Williamsburg as part of the Haunted Williamsburg program and so forth. But in the 18th century, did they believe in ghosts, and what did people here in Williamsburg think about ghosts back then?
I like that they're two separate questions. Because there's a difference sort of between ghost stories and what they believe about ghosts. So one of the things that you see in terms of what they believe about ghosts is where they show up and what they do. And this is going to be true actually in the African-American tradition. There's a lot of overlap here. One of the places that they're seen very often is near water, because it's sort of seen as this sort of mystical space in between worlds. So that's pretty common in the 18th century experience for both groups. Another thing is the idea that they are protecting something, and they may be protecting a buried treasure or a family member or a house. My favorite, though, is the ones who stick around to avenge their death. And we actually have a story of that takes place in Wise County, Virginia, that's actually in detail told in the book Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, which is kind of exciting. In terms of ghost stories, in terms of what they experience from that perspective, they're funny because, like I said about Halloween, they're not really talking ghosts at Halloween. This is the time they're doing this at Christmas. Now, there are some very important differences. The way they tell their ghost stories don't really cut it by our standards. Very often you know who the ghost is ahead of time. The ghost story itself folds out very slowly. It's got a moral. But the thing is, and they tell them around Christmas. So the thing is, this sounds weird to us, but it's actually not that weird because you're familiar with this idea. If you've ever read A Christmas Carol, It meets every single one of those, right? We know Jacob Marley because it's announced in the very beginning that he was dead. 3 spirits visit him through the course of a night, so it takes a little while to unfold. Spirits, the course of the night. It's told at Christmas time, and it has a moral. So this is something that actually, so that's 19th century, and it's England, but they're doing the same thing in the 18th century. And sort of, this is a great example of something becoming famous across what becomes the United States, because people, even though it's early, it's the 19th century, people grew up understanding these kinds of stories.
Now, here's a good question really for you and your research. Aria says, what's your favorite superstition to research?
What is my favorite superstition? Anything, this is going to sound so strange, anything that has to do, that includes something with the body. It sounds weird. So I really like the witch's bottle because it's full of hair and nails, but it would also have things like potentially urine or spit, anything that's going to tie it directly to the body. In fact, one of the things I really love is something we have in our special collections. It is a little itty bitty document. It's from about 1700, and this is actually a witch's amulet. What this is doing is, this is sort of that idea of the sympathetic magic again. What this is doing is protecting the person who has it on them from being bewitched or being molested or disturbed. That's the language they actually use within it. This was worn close to the body. Actually, Colonial Williamsburg got a men's jacket, men's coat, men's coat. And when they looked in the lining, they found that amulet. So this is an example where he probably doesn't want anybody to know what's going on with him, but he's got it, and he's got it close to himself. So anything that has to do with people and wearing things close to the body, so once again, the pierced coin around the ankle, around the neck, anything that's actually touching people, I think is the most interesting because it's the hardest to recapture, and it's the hardest relationship to recapture.
And that's an amazing thing to find, too. Wow. Carol asks, did the colonists recognize the difference between good witches and bad witches?
Yeah, so this is a good question because it touches that idea of, okay, who's a witch and who's not? And so there's I think, did I mention the Supreme Court case?
No.
Okay. So there's a Supreme Court case in the 20th century where they're trying to define what something is. And it's a really squishy thing.
Yes.
I did talk about this
Yes.
already.
But bring it...
Okay, so a really squishy thing, because this is going to give you a little more, really, really squishy thing. And you're trying to figure out, well, how do you figure it out? And the fact that one of the Supreme Court justices just said, I know when I see it, is kind of the way they work through who's a witch and who's not, or who's dangerous and who's not. So it's one of these things where they can look at someone and go, oh, yeah, that woman is awful and she blighted my crops, she's a witch. Oh, but her sister, who made my daughter a love potion so she can get married soon, she's not a witch. The answer is, if they use their own definition, they're both witches. But that distinction it's organic. It's totally based on the people within. When you talk about the African-American experience, it's a little bit different because what you see in that tradition generally in British North America and the West Indies is that they, British North America and the British West Indies, they practice something that we would call today gray magic, which means they do things to both help and harm people. So it's the idea of there's black and white and then there's gray in the middle. And for that reason, the line is very blurred. Now there is a recognition of people coming out of that West African tradition where it's like, okay, there is something really wrong coming off of you. But at the same time, sort of in our situation, and what you see very often is these guys who are, and women, both, sort of at the same time, which is, I think, one of the other things that scares the white Virginians, and that's why they pass that law. Interesting.
We have a question here from Alexia, who asks, what's the difference between voodoo and hoodoo, and was hoodoo practiced in the 18th century?
Great question. Great question. So when we talk about voodoo, we're talking about voodoo, which is a religion. And really what that religion is, it's a, like I said, really neat melding of the two, of Roman Catholicism and traditional African beliefs and practices. So they come together. And they are essentially a faith. They are a religion. When you talk more about Hudu, it's not tied the same way to any religion. Because you'll see the Hudu tradition, people are of all kinds of religious backgrounds, especially today. So it's one of these things where, I don't want to say it's unmoored, because that's not true. It's that it's not a full religion with a full, its own practices. It's sort of this, using sort of the way the unit language you often see is energy. They use sort of energy to influence the world. And it uses a series of traditions that are both African American, and European. That there's sort of this mix. So basically, it's more Hudu is this is very oversimplifying. Hudu is a magical system, where Voodoo is a religion. That's a very simple way of describing it, but it gives you a real sense of sort of how they operate.
Let's go back to witches for a moment.
Oh, of course.
Tina asks, is there evidence of physical punishment of witches in Williamsburg?
Okay. No. So this is sort of strange. It depends on how you also use the idea of punishment, right? So there's a few things going on. The answer simply is we don't have any evidence of that. No. But the process by which they figure out if someone is a witch is physical punishment by our standards. So one of the things is there's a series of trials that are developed. Actually, they're developed in the medieval period. They go away and then they come back in the 17th century. And what they are means to figure out whether or not someone's a witch. One of them was ducking. And this is a great... So we have a really great image of a woman being ducked. This actually comes out of an Irish pamphlet from 1613, but the basics are the same. So you'll see that there is a guy, or two guys I should say, who are in the process of lowering this woman down who is trussed up. So thumb to toe, opposites. And really what they're doing is they're trying to see whether or not she sinks or floats. If she sinks, the expectation is that her soul is pure. They don't just let her drown. That makes me nuts when people say that. No, they go in and they pull them out because they don't want to kill them. If they float, that's a different thing. They failed that trial because the pure water rejected them. So then they go in for other types of examinations, which is one of the... They did do this to Grace Sherwood in Virginia Beach. As part of her trials to see if she is a witch. So this is their very scientific system. One of the other things they'll do is take something called a witch's pin. There's a bunch of places that would do this. And what they would do is if they found some sort of irregularity, something that we would consider like a mole, and if they pierced it and it did not bleed, and you didn't feel it, that's the mark of the devil. So from the sense of punishment, no, but in the sense of like being dragged out into the water and, dunked, then told that you are evil, and you're brought back again, and then they stick you with a big pin that you may or may not feel anything. I mean, every time I tell somebody that, they go, I do have a mole like that. I really do. Before you even go to trial, because the punishment, of course, if she'd been convicted of felony witchcraft, she would have been hanged. Hanged is important. Hanged is what happens in Salem. Hanged is what happens here. Hanged is the punishment in British North America for witchcraft because they're being executed for a felony. So you do not see witches being burned in British North America or even the West Indies. That's not the way they minister justice because to them, they think they're still participating in their very sane and organized legal system.
We have another question here from McKenna. Who asks, what are some vestiges of superstition that we still do by tradition, but may not recognize as such?
They say actually knocking on wood is the biggest one for Americans. One of the things that they say about that, and when you go back and you look at it, it goes back to the medieval period and holding a cross made of wood. in certain, when to swear by, kind of like they hold the Bible in the 18th century. They hold the cross, and it's usually wooden, and that basically from that holding it in their hand and kind of putting it down, that's where that one comes from. You do see this in 18th century. I've never seen it specifically in Virginia, but I've seen it referenced in New Jersey and Connecticut. So that idea of knocking on wood, we still do that one. That one is huge. But once again, this is something that comes from before the 18th century and continues on through, which I think is kind of amazing.
Interesting. All right, we have a question from Jameson, who asks, what was the role of alchemy in the 16th and 17th century colonial American society?
Okay, the answer is not much. And I don't mean that to be dismissive. I think one of the things when we talk about that which even then they call the occult sciences, the hidden sciences, that's all occult means. We don't see a lot of it practiced here, in part because the people who are in the process, who do practice it, are in England. They usually have a good enough setup that they don't need to go, but they're not going to be like, oh, I'm going to go to America where who knows what's going to happen. So some of these guys are very comfortable in their lifestyle. The idea of alchemy, both the idea of turning lead into gold or the perfection of the soul, and both ideas sort of float around at the same time, is not really big because of the types of people who come here. We have peasants, and we have, the poor out of England, out of London, and we have all of these people. In addition to that, you get to North America, get into New England, you've got guys who are not cool with this stuff. So they're really educated, but they're not cool with it. Most of the people who actually come here aren't going to be tied into that tradition. So for that reason is why I kind of laugh, because the answer is like, these guys are sort of all over the place, that would be a lot for them to focus on, especially in the very beginning of the 17th century.
Well, we have another question here from Dawn, who asks, were there superstitions when setting up a household or building a new home or outbuilding like a barn?
So this is going to go back to who you're talking about and when. One of the things we know, we know it's an 18th century phenomenon, but we only have evidence of it happening here in the 19th century, is actually building shoes into walls. The idea, once again, it's being serving for the purpose of protection. So that is something that's going on, and we know it's going on in the 18th century because there are other examples. We just don't have any ones that are literally right here.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to take a moment to say thank you to Dr. Arehart for joining us here today. This was a fascinating conversation. I also want to say thank you to those of you who are out there watching this, as well as all of those great questions that you put to us. Those were fantastic. A big thank you goes out to our donors as well for keeping this program supported, as well as many other programs here at Colonial Williamsburg. We hope that you'll come visit us in person whenever you can. We'd love to see you. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.